Welcome to the Matchfit Conditioning Podcast. Transforming over 100,000 footballers worldwide. Everything we do is aimed at enabling you to gain an edge completely by yourself without needing help from a training partner or teammate. Open yourself to doing things smarter and with more intention, focus and attention to detail than your teammates, opponents and even your coaches. Are you ready to get match fit?
Hi guys, thanks so much for sending in your questions. Today we're going to be tackling a question on hamstring injuries, how to rehab them properly and how to prevent re-injury from occurring. So before we get into the specifics of your rehab plan and your injury prevention work, it's important to know what the hamstring muscle group is and how it ends up breaking down to start with. So essentially your hamstring muscle group, or your HMG as we'll call it, is made up of three individual muscles: the semimembranosus, the semitendinosus, and the biceps femoris. So the HMG originates at an area called the ischial tuberosity, which is a pointy bone just below the glute. It then inserts into the tibia and fibula, or the back of your lower leg just below the knee. The HMG is primarily responsible for bending the knee and extending the hip, which makes it vital in terms of actions like running and sprinting. So typically an injury to the HMG happens in the thicker central part of the muscle or where the muscle meets the tendon. And you can also suffer from various grades of HMG injury, which all depends on the level of damage to the muscle itself. So the more damage there is, obviously the longer the rehab process or the recovery process is going to take. So it's important to mention a little bit about the function of the HMG, as that's going to directly impact the rehab and strengthening process at a later stage. As with all muscles, the HMG can contract isometrically, concentrically, or eccentrically. So an isometric contraction would be something like a static glute bridge, where there's tension or force going through the muscle, but the muscle fibers are not getting longer or shorter. The next would be a concentric contraction, and this would be something like a prone hamstring curl, where the force created is directly related to the hamstring getting shorter. And lastly, you have an eccentric contraction, which would be something like a prone hamstring curl, but instead of curling the weight up, it's lowering the weight down in a slow, controlled manner. So essentially, the muscle is getting longer while it's still under tension. So we'll come back to that a little bit later, as eccentric training is vital to the HMG rehab process, as well as injury prevention. So how do you pick up an HMG injury exactly? Well, the primary cause is down to good old-fashioned muscle overload. So if you had to imagine your HMG as an elastic band, which stretches every time you sprint or kick, and you're doing that 50 to 60 times a day, over time the band will overstretch or snap, unless you allow it time to rest and recover, or alternatively, you add multiple bands together to make it a stronger unit. So basically a strong eccentric contraction, for example sprinting, where your back leg is straightened and loaded by your body weight, and the force of the contraction combined, would result in an injury in an overloaded HMG. You're also at risk of picking up an HMG injury if you have tight hamstrings, you have muscle imbalances in muscle groups such as your quadriceps, or you have poorly developed HMG strength. So if your strength in the HMG is not up to standard, or the HMG is fatigued, that puts you at risk of injury. So let's fast forward directly to the question, or the main question. You've picked up an HMG injury, you've seen a medical professional like a physio or sports physician, and you received treatment. And you're now pain-free and being given the green light to start strengthening the hamstring. What now? Well, in conjunction with what your physio has been giving you and prescribing, it's time to get into the gym and strengthen the hamstring muscle group. So your rehab process should follow a multi-step approach to make sure you don't do too much too soon and aggravate your previous injury. So as with all training, if you feel or experience any pain whatsoever, you should stop immediately and seek medical treatment. Right, so step one of your rehab process would be your basic isometric strength development. And this is where you'd introduce the concept of loading and angles to your training. So you primarily perform more static holds to build up your HMG tolerance, and your basic exercises would involve things like planking, glute bridging, or wall squats. And initially you'd start off with the basics like 2-foot holds, and then as time goes by you'd progress to single leg variations. You'd also initially perform 2 to 3 sets of anywhere between 20 and 30 seconds depending on your current physical ability, and progress to 3 to 4 sets of 30 to 45 seconds. Your next step would involve your concentric exercise movements. This step would include exercises like your kettlebell swings, your bilateral stiff leg deadlifts, prone or standing hamstring curls, and lunges. So essentially within this step we'd be increasing the load on the HMG, as well as introducing concepts like speed or velocity as well as range. So ideally you need to start off with a lower load or weight and slowly increase the load as your HMG begins to tolerate more work. So after the initial 2 to 3 weeks in this phase, you can begin to experiment with speed or velocity of the exercises. So an example would be your standard kettlebell swing. Here you'd use a lighter weight, but your movement would be a lot faster. You'd also be able to perform some light jogging or cardio with this step to build up your aerobic base and also help a little bit with your recovery. So typically you should be performing 2 to 3 sets of 6 to 10 reps initially, and then progressing slowly to 3 to 4 sets of 8 to 10 reps once you feel more comfortable. Your next step would involve adding eccentric exercise movements into your existing strength work. So as I mentioned before, this involves lowering a weight at a much slower rate. An example would be if you've ever seen a Nordic hamstring curl, that would be your eccentric component. So this essentially involves, let's say, 2 seconds of concentric contraction followed by 5 seconds of eccentric contraction. Examples of exercises would be 45-degree hip extension, straight knee bridging, glute ham raises, Nordics, and single leg deadlifts. You'll also be able to do some on-field tempo runs at this stage of your rehab and perform all ball-based technical work at training. You can also follow the same set rep plan as the concentric step. So lastly, your final step would be your power and return to play step. And here we're really trying to test the HMG and see if it manages the full load of what we're putting it through. So exercises like plyometric box jumps, jump squats, broad jumps, and if you have access to a watt bike, jumping and doing some watt bike intervals would be great. Those are all great ways to test your hamstring or your HMG while developing some lower body power. You should also be able to add in some on-field sprints at this stage of your rehab to make sure that your hamstring is good and proper and ready for the full training. This also forms part of an injury prevention perspective. And ideally, sprinting often and sprinting fast is a great way to condition your HMG and develop some strength. So you need to try this kind of training for 2 to 3 days a week and see how you go. If you feel stiff after this final step, you need to dial it down a little bit to make sure your recovery process is good. Obviously, being a highly explosive component, you don't want to do this while you're experiencing a lot of muscle soreness or stiffness. That'll just put you at risk of injury. So my advice would be to take your rehab slow and not rush it too quickly. Don't go into your next step too soon. Rather build up your HMG strength, and hopefully you should stay injury free if you follow this step-by-step process. Guys, thanks again for sending in your questions, and keep an eye on the Matchfit conditioning page to see if your question gets featured next.
Thanks for tuning into the Matchfit Conditioning Podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with one of your teammates. To learn more about the Matchfit method and to start your training with us, visit www.matchfitconditioning.com. We'll show you how to gain an edge on the pitch at an elite level by transforming your fitness level, nutrition, and mindset.